All right, folks, welcome to another episode of the FNG, the Flying New Guy, which is Jason. If you're not familiar with the format, Jason is going to get his private pilot certificate. He's one of our employees, and we are doing ground lessons with him. Tom right here is our CFI on staff, certified flight instructor. And then, of course, I'm also a flight instructor. So we're going to be grilling Jason over these lessons over time. And today we are talking about flight instruments. And this might take maybe even 2 different episodes to do that. We'll see how it goes. We try to keep them to about a half-hour episode so you guys can watch and learn at the same time. This is a slightly different environment than what you would see in your flight school. Maybe when you do ground lessons with your instructor, there's no penny laying on the ground. There's no comfortable seats. Usually you're in a cubicle with a whiteboard. But we're doing this more comfortable. And let's get started with the flying instruments. And I think one of the important concepts with the flight instruments, especially with some of them, is talking about the pressure outside. What's the atmospheric pressure? What does that look like? What's the concept of
It's the weight
pressure?
of air.
The weight of air, okay. The weight of air, and then how is it measured?
In what industry?
That's right. A lot of different ways, right?
There's a bunch of different ways.
There are a lot of different ways. So in aviation, how do we measure it typically?
Inches of mercury.
Inches of mercury. All right. So that's going to become important when we start talking about some of these instruments. Now, there is there's a reference that we use. Do you remember what that is? The standard day?
It's standard day.
Yeah. What's the definition of a standard day?
15 C, 59 Fahrenheit, sea level, and 2992
Inches of mercury.
inches of mercury.
Yep. Why is that important? Why is that reference important?
That's what we base all of our calculations off of, essentially.
Yep.
It's a hypothetical standard that very rarely, if ever, exists.
And so based on that, and you're right, it rarely exists. Based on that, how are the changes in pressure going, or even temperature, going to affect us? Why do we care?
Changes in pressure and temperature affect performance and what your altimeter is going to read.
Okay. Yep. That's really good.
No, I like that answer.
Good. I do too. So, what's the worst possible scenario as far as temperature and pressure in relationship to standard day? Like colder, warmer, what's better?
Warmer is worse.
Warmer is worse.
Higher or lower pressure is worse.
Lower pressure is worse. So I always tell people, yeah, go ahead.
And humidity.
And humidity as well. Yeah. So we haven't really talked about humidity because it's not. It's something that we need to account for to a certain extent, but it's not something that we pay too close attention to in aviation. Interestingly, I think the effect on performance is not significant enough that we usually worry about it. Although you should, when you notice the higher level of humidity. But yeah, I always tell students a very hot day in Florida in the middle of a hurricane. That's right. That's high, low pressure, high temperature. Okay, so. Talking about these flight instruments, we have, and when we talk about a 6-pack in this case, just to keep it simple, there's 2 different types of instruments because they work on 2 different systems. Do you remember the 2 different systems that they work on?
The Pitot-static is one.
Pitot-static is one.
The others are gyroscopic.
Gyroscopic system.
Okay.
All right. So let's get started with the pitot-static system. What does pitot-static mean?
It uses a static port and a pitot tube to calculate differential pressure.
Okay.
And then displays certain information based on that differential pressures.
Okay. So the pitot-static system is how many instruments?
3.
3.
It is your airspeed indicator.
Airspeed indicator.
Your altimeter.
Altimeter.
VSI.
VSI. Vertical speed indicator. Okay. Which one of these works out of the static port?
All 3.
All 3, yes. It's not a trick question.
Which one of these?
Well, which ones? Yeah, sorry. Which ones, in parentheses, S, of these works out of the pitot tube?
The airspeed indicator.
Only?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm thinking about how the...
Are you sure?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm thinking about how the systems actually work.
I'm pulling
Here.
the DPE Are you sure? Yeah, I'm sure. Okay. All right, let's move on. So the pitot tube does what? The pitot tube measures what?
How much air is being forced into that port, essentially.
Ram
Okay.
air.
Ram air.
Ram air. Yep. And it gets into that little tube. Now they all look different. On the 172, it's kind of a thing that comes out.
L-looking thing.
Yeah. On the Piper, it's more of a fin.
Yeah, it looks kind
Looking.
of like the transponder fin.
Yeah. So they all can look different. How does the altimeter know how fast you're going?
The altimeter doesn't know how
I'm
fast
sorry.
you're going.
The airspeed indicator.
No
Good.
trick questions.
That was a
today.
trick question. That was a trick question. How does it know? How does it know how fast?
It calculates the difference between your ram air pressure and your static pressure.
Okay. Why do we need a static pressure? Why not just use the ram air pressure?
Because variable pressures and or temperatures and altitudes is going to give you a different amount of air that can get into that port.
Yep. What's when we talk about that airspeed that you read on the instrument, what is that called? There's different types of airspeed. What's that one called?
It should be your calibrated airspeed.
Nope.
No,
Almost.
almost
What's indicated on the
indicated airspeed.
So what's calibrated airspeed? So calibrated airspeed is pretty close, right? Calibrated is the indicated airspeed corrected for installation errors. AKA, there's a tube, right, that takes that air, that ram air pressure into the instrument.
Right.
You lose some of that along the way. There's
So
a
the
correction that
instrument
needs.
Isn't calibrated on its own.
So it's accurate at one airspeed. And there's usually a chart in the POH that's going to tell you what that airspeed is. Because if you think in a Cessna, you think when we're doing, I know you haven't flown yet, but like when we're doing slow flight, we're at a high angle of attack, we're at a really low airspeed. So our pitot tube is pointed up like this. And if our air is coming like this, it's not going to be accurate. If we're at 90 knots, which I think in the Cessna is about what it's calibrated for, then the air is going to be coming straight in. But if we're going pretty fast and we're tilted down a little bit, then it's still not going to be coming straight in. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's what the calibrated airspeed is
Okay.
used for.
So the calibrated airspeed is essentially your benchmark to prove that you're accurate at one airspeed and everything else is indicated.
Well, what you're going to see is, so for your indicated airspeed, let's say your indicated airspeed is 55 knots, but your calibrated airspeed is going to be 52 knots. So when you're indicating 55, your actual airspeed due to error is going to be 52 knots.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
So there's a chart. You just see indicated airspeed is this, calibrated airspeed is this. So it's kind of a step process because indicated airspeed doesn't really tell us much as far as performance. Calibrated airspeed, indicated airspeed is only good really for flying the airplane. That's what you need to fly the airplane, because it's the amount of air that's hitting the aircraft, right?
Right.
If you take the aircraft in a vacuum and in just the aircraft not moving, and then you have the airflow going around it like you would in a wind tunnel, that's what you're basically measuring the amount of air that's hitting the airplane in the wind tunnel, right? Within the air mass in itself, and that's what you need. That's why we look at different things like indicated airspeed and true airspeed and ground speed, because they're all really different references. So that indicated airspeed is important for flying the airplane. That's not going to change based on how high you are, where you are. That's what you use to fly the aircraft. Now, calibrated airspeed is an intermediate speed, I like to call it. It's something to get to the next thing, which is your true airspeed. Now, what is true airspeed?
It's your true speed.
It's the actual airspeed of the aircraft through the air mass.
Yes.
Through the air mass. And that changes with what?
It's going to change with winds. And
it's going to change with
non-standard temperature
and
pressure.
Okay. So that's your calibrated airspeed corrected for non-standard pressures and temperatures. As you start to climb, the thickness of the air changes, the performance of the aircraft change, your true airspeed is going to change. Your indicated airspeed might remain the same. You might still be flying at 100 knots, but your true airspeed is going to be different if you're flying at 100 knots indicated at sea level or at 100 knots indicated at 18,000 feet. That indicated airspeed is going to be the same. The true airspeed is going to be different because of difference in pressure, difference in temperature. So you'll see in the aircraft, in some aircraft, there's a little knob on the airspeed indicator, especially on a 6-pack, that you can turn. And in there, you can set altitude and pressure. And if you use an old school E6B, how do you find your true airspeed? By setting pressure and temperature at an altitude, and then you'll be able to convert your calibrated airspeed to your true airspeed. Okay?
Yep.
So, and then the next one, the last one is your ground speed. Now, what is your ground speed?
It's how fast you're driving, essentially.
It's
how fast you're traveling across the ground.
Yeah, in relationship to the ground.
As reference.
Yeah. So you get that air mass, and that air mass might be moving as well. So if the air mass is not moving, if there is no wind, calibrated true airspeed equals ground speed. If that air mass is moving because of the wind, then the ground speed is going to be different, right? So what's the worst thing, a headwind or a tailwind as far as your ground speed to make it faster?
To go faster.
To go faster. What is the best thing to have? Tailwind? Tailwind. Okay. So it's going to push you around.
Yeah, the one way to remember it is ICE-T.
ICE-T.
Indicated, calibrated. Well, we didn't cover equivalent,
Yep.
which is something that in general aviation aircraft we're not really going to have to deal with too much. But that's really for higher performance aircraft. And correct me if I'm wrong, but what it is it's air packing around the pitot tube. What happens is that airplane's going so fast that not enough air can get into the pitot tube. There's
a disturbance in the entrance of the pitot tube.
There's a disturbance, so the reading isn't quite accurate. So it's ICE-T. And if you remember, the previous one is corrected by the next one. So indicated airspeed is what's read off the dial. Calibrated airspeed is indicated airspeed for installation and aircraft error. Equivalent airspeed is calibrated airspeed for compressibility error. True airspeed is equivalent airspeed corrected for non-standard temperature and pressure, and ground speed is true airspeed corrected for wind.
Yeah. So ICE-T and then G.
ICE-T-G.
Is ICE-T-G. So all these are very important. All these airspeeds are very important. On your airspeed indicator, there's a bunch of markings. Do you remember what the markings are? The different colors?
If I can look at the air indicator, I do. I think.
Let me pull you one here. I went ahead because I'm in the altimeter already.
So the
white. Let's start with the white.
The white is your I believe it's a stall speed in a specific configuration.
The bottom of it.
The bottom of it.
Yep.
The white is it's flaps.
It's flaps.
Flaps.
Yep.
Flaps operating range.
So the top of it is called what? You remember? So the bottom of it is called VS0, or we call it VSO, but it's VS0 really, because some people say O instead of 0.
Yeah.
Tom get in trouble for saying.
Yeah, ATC got mad at me because I said 402 Echo Romeo instead of 402 Echo Romeo. So the airliners were doing it for saying 007 American, on center, but it's fine. It's fine.
So VS0, VSO, that's your stall speed in the landing configuration. Hence, because it's when you land, you have flaps on, right?
Yes.
So that's the bottom of the white arc is landing in the landing configuration. That's your stall speed. So it's easy to remember. Stay away from that. Give yourself a little bit of margin so you don't get to that point. And then the top of the white arc would be what? You remember?
I don't.
VFE.
VFE.
Flaps
V
extended.
flaps extended.
Yep. Flaps extended. So you cannot fly any faster than that with the flaps extended. Or else what?
You'll damage your flaps.
Yeah, you could damage the aircraft. Okay. Then we have the green arc. What's the green arc?
Normal operating speeds.
Normal operating. Okay. And then the bottom of the green arc would be what?
The bottom of the green arc
Yeah.
would be your stall speed flaps up.
Yep. And so they call it in a specified configuration because I think it might be different for some aircraft.
Yeah, I think you're right.
It's always called a specified configuration.
Specified configuration.
But typically it's with no flaps. And then the top of the green arc is what?
It's your maximum cruising speed, right?
It's the maximum cruising speed. Okay. Let's go VNO.
VNO.
VNO, yeah. And I don't remember what it stands for. I don't even know if I ever knew what it stands for, what the O stands for.
I don't remember.
Normal operation, maybe? Probably normal operation. So the key here is what? Then we have the yellow arc. Can you fly in the yellow arc?
You can.
When? As long as. There's a caveat. Okay. In
Smooth air.
in smooth air.
Oh, I was gonna say. I think I got it.
Yeah. That's why
as long as there's no turbulence.
As long as there's no turbulence, because if there's turbulence, what could happen is that you can exceed the structure. You can exceed the G limits of the aircraft, which would cause structural damage to the aircraft. So in smooth air, you're fine, but in that range, you don't want to do a lot of G forces on the aircraft, because if you exceed the G forces, then you create issues with the aircraft. In the green arc, what happens if you exceed the G forces? Let's say you're flying with Tom, and then you're flying in the green arc, and then Tom pulls really hard on the control. What's going to happen?
It's probably going to stall it.
It's going to stall.
Yeah, we're going to enter an accelerated stall.
It's going to stall, and that's the key between the two. And that's all in the VG diagram. If you remember the VG diagram, I think we look at it in the future chapters, but that's exactly what happens. So you got to be careful there. And then at the end of the yellow arc, we have what?
The never exceed speed.
Yeah, which is the red
VNE.
line, VNE.
I remember that one.
Yeah, what if you exceed that?
Your airplane could come apart.
Yeah, so you can create structural failure. So structural damage.
Structural damage in the yellow, structural failure above the yellow.
Yeah. So, we talked about this accident that happened in Pilatus, although we don't know exactly what happened, but we had talked about possibly them exceeding, well, the aircraft fell apart, right? They get destroyed in flight in the middle of a big storm. So one of potentialities that they basically exceeded VNE, and then structural failure at that stage, wings fall apart and all that good stuff. Well, bad stuff, I should say. Okay, there's some airspeeds that are not depicted on the airspeed indicator. Do you remember? What if I say VA? Do you know what VA is?
No.
Okay,
I do
so
not.
Veterans Administration.
It's your maneuvering speed.
You should know. We dealt with them enough. So maneuvering speed. What's the maneuvering speed? What does it mean?
That's this. Is it the minimum speed you would want to conduct maneuvers at?
It's the maximum speed you want.
Maximum speed you would
Yes.
want to conduct maneuvers.
Do you know why it's not charted? Why it's not listed on the airspeed indicator? Do you remember?
No, I don't.
Because it changes with weight.
Okay.
Yeah, it depends. It depends on the weight. Then we have a few landing gear things. You have VLO, which is the operating speed at which you can operate the gear, so extending or retracting the gear. In most aircraft, it's the same as VLE, which is the landing gear extension speed, the maximum speed at which you can extend. So there's some aircraft have two different speeds, so you have to be careful. You don't have to worry about that right now because that's not where you're going to fly. Then there's VMC that I talk about in the course, but we can skip that. Now there's two other speeds that are important on takeoff, which are VX and VY.
Well, I think there's three speeds important on takeoff. Your
VY
VR.
cruise? Oh, VR. Yeah, well, of course. Yeah, VR as well. Let's start with VR because that's the first one. What's VR?
Your rotate speed?
Rotation speed. Yeah. What is that?
It's when you start to pitch up to actually take off.
Okay. And why do we have that speed? What information does it give us? Why do we care about that?
Because your aircraft is going to want to take off early because of ground effect. So if you take off before your rotation speed, you get stuck in ground effect where you're not actually going fast enough to get out of ground effect.
Get out of ground.
And so you're stuck.
Yep. That's when you want to start pulling on flight controls, not too early, especially when you're at a high altitude. I have a bad tendency to usually rotate a little too early here at a high altitude. And then VX. What's VX?
VX is best climb over a certain distance.
Yep.
Correct?
Yep.
You're clearing an obstacle.
Best
and V-
angle of climb.
Best
angle of climb.
Yep.
And your VY is your best climb over time.
Yep.
Best rate of
It's
climb.
rate of climb.
Best rate of climb.
Yep. So angle because it's a distance, rate because it's time.
Time.
Yep. And that's how you remember. When do you use VX?
When you need to clear something at the end of the runway.
Yeah. When you need to get off the ground quickly in a short distance, there's an obstacle at the end, then you're going to do that. Why don't we use VX all the time?
Because it's not your best rate of climb.
Because it's not best rate of climb. So yeah, over time, you want to be able to get to a certain distance. It's a bit more efficient to use VY.
Okay.
There's a lot of reason. There's several reasons for it. First off, very high pitch, which means that you can't really see obstacles outside. Very high pitch means you're closer to your stall speed, which, you get a bit more of a buffer with VY. And then very high pitch means less airflow getting into the engine to cool it off, right? Our engine is air cooled, not liquid cooled. So we need to be, especially in the summer, when you fly in the summer in the hot weather, you probably know that better.
Yeah, we had
anybody.
problems with the Archers getting right close to red line when we were just trying to get up to altitude because we're only climbing at 300 feet per minute.
Wow. That's Tom flies in the valley in Phoenix where it gets pretty darn hot in the summer.
Too hot.
too damn hot. We have a saying, but I'm not going to say it live on air for what Phoenix is. I have a saying, but it's not. It's not YouTube safe. Okay. Any additional questions on the airspeed indicator?
No, I think it's covered pretty well.
Okay. Then the next instrument is your altimeter. How does the altimeter work? How does it work?
It reads the outside pressure and then gives you an altitude based on whatever you set your baseline to.
Okay. All right. Baseline. So tell me more about the baseline. What
Your baseline is going to be your altimeter setting.
Your altimeter setting. Okay. Now, inside the instrument, do you know how it works? What there is inside the instrument?
Just a little wafer.
A little wafer. Yeah.
And that
What's
wafer-
inside the wafer?
Inside the wafer?
Yeah.
The wafer sealed, right?
There's air inside the wafer.
Okay.
And what kind of air is inside the wafer?
What kind of air?
I know where you're going. It's a hard question to ask. That's what I was trying to get to.
What pressure of air? Sea level?
So would it be standard?
I
Pressure
assume
and
it's
temperature?
standard day,
Okay.
Yeah. It's 2992 on the inside.
but it can't be standard because it's
The temperature, I don't think
isn't
the
going to be
temperature
right.
is.
So it's going to be 2992,
Right.
right?
Yeah, 2992. So what does you said you can set the pressure. Are you setting the pressure inside the wafer when you set that little window?
You're calibrating. You're calibrating whether your pressure is above or below that 2992, and
Yeah, it's a calibration gear. You're right. It's a little knob that you twist, and all you're doing is you're just changing the reference where the zero is located on your watch. It's like saying, having a manual watch, and you can set it to whatever you want. So yeah, you're just moving the gears. It's a little lever that moves the
What's
gears.
that window called? The Colesman window?
Colesman. I had a friend in college. His name was Coleman, and so I always, and it's spelled differently, but I always spell it that way for some reason.
You call it the Coleman window?
The Coleman window. Yeah.
All right. So what's it actually called?
The
Colesman.
Colesman.
Kolls man. Kolls Colesman window. So very much like what we have in the airspeed indicator, we have different types of altitudes. Do you remember what they are?
AGL and MSL?
Okay, well, let's get started with that.
Indicated altitude?
We'll get to that in a second. But you start with MSL and AGL, and I think that's important. What's the difference between the two?
Just your reference.
Just your reference.
Sea level versus surface.
Sea level versus surface. So MSL stands for
Mean sea level.
mean sea level. Okay, and then AGL,
Above ground level.
above ground level. So which one does the airspeed indicator tell us?
The airspeed indicator?
No, the altitude, the altimeter. Damn it.
The altimeter is going to... Our reference is sea level. So it's MSL.
MSL. Yep. And why? Why is that? Why don't we want to know? We're going to be flying over mountains here. Why don't we want to know the altitude above the
Because
mountains?
it's changing quickly.
Because it changes all the time.
And you want everybody on the same plane, or the same reference plane.
Yeah.
The ground isn't flat. If you've got somebody who is over the mountains over here at, 500 feet AGL, and you're like, oh, I'm fine. I'm at 3,000 feet above where we are. AGL, you're on the same plane.
You're on the same plane, same reference. So when you say you're at 3,000 feet and you say you're at 3,000 feet in your airplane, we're at the same altitude. So,
Yes.
because he could be 500 feet above the ground, I could be 1,000 feet above the ground. That doesn't tell anything to anyone. So when you take off at the airport, is the altimeter going to show 0?
No, it should show whatever your field elevation is,
Unless
unless you're at sea level.
there you go. Okay, good. But the reason I'm asking all these questions is because a lot of students get confused with that at first. If you haven't been in an airplane, it's natural to feel like if the aircraft is on the runway, you might think, oh, I want it to show 0 because I'm going to be doing rounds in the pattern, for example. And no, that's not how it works. You need to have the airport elevation showing on your thing. Okay. I'm trying to think about the pressure that you're going to put into your altimeter comes from where?
A METAR.
A METAR? What else?
Or whatever weather information you can get.
So if you go to a controlled airport, how would you know without looking at the METAR?
ATIS.
The ATIS, okay. ATIS is that automated report that you get on the radio. If you go to an uncontrolled airport,
There might not be a weather station. At
There might not be.
Station. Or
and if there is, what would it be called?
if there is,
Yeah,
it would be AWAS or ASOS.
EWAS or ASOS. Okay, good. And then there's another way, which you probably don't know because you haven't flown, but the controller might tell you, or the person in charge of that block of airspace that you're in. So when we fly to the Grand Canyon, which we've done a couple times now, on the way there, you talking to center, LA center, Albuquerque center, whatever center is in your area. They are in charge of a larger block of airspace between airports, and they'll tell you when you go from places to places. Altimeter reported at this area at this, so then you just reset your altimeter. That number that they give you, is that the actual pressure at that airport? Let's say we go to Prescott today and the pressure is reported at 29, let's say 2992. Is it because the pressure at 5,000 feet in Prescott is 2992?
It's corrected for it being at sea level.
It's corrected for being at sea level. The reason I'm asking this is because I did all my training in Florida, and Florida is sea level everywhere. And not until several years after doing my training, I got to airports that were way above sea level, and I started realizing that the pressure there was not really the pressure that was reported.
Mm-hmm.
So today, if it's 2992 inches of mercury reported in Prescott, the actual pressure outside would be
2492,
2492, roughly 5 inches less, 1 inch per 1,000 feet. So that's important to understand, because what is your altimeter doing? You put 2992 in the altimeter window.
It's still referencing sea level.
It's referencing sea level, and it's reading the pressure outside, which is 2492,
and it's giving your altitude MSL. So on the runway, it should be 5045, I think.
5,000, roughly 5,000 feet, right? 5,045 feet, because of that pressure differential. So that's the important part that people don't understand, is everything is always going to look like a pretty high number regardless of where you are. Okay. We might just, let me see here.
What's the altimeter going to read if the static port becomes blocked?
Whatever air is stuck in there.
The static port.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was on the airspeed indicator.
Yeah,
for some reason.
the altimeter is going to read whatever air is stuck in there. So you're going to be able to climb and descend, and there's going to be no visual change on your altimeter.
Yep.
Okay.
How did you fix that?
Land and unblock it.
There's several different things. Is there anything anywhere else in the aircraft that might give us a secondary reading?
I mean, there may be a second set of
So most aircraft
instruments
are equipped with they call it an alternate static source, and it's usually vented inside the cabin.
Okay.
So like if your outside static port comes blocked, you have one inside, and you can hit you can turn it on, and what it'll tend to do is it'll actually read a little bit higher. And it reads higher. Like at the private level, you don't really need to have a thorough understanding of it, but the reason why is the Venturi effect, because the pressure outside is lower because it's moving, the pressure inside is a little bit higher, so it's going to read a little bit higher.
Okay.
And then if for some reason you do pick up icing, you don't have to, you gotta, in a 172, you gotta be very careful about staying out of icing conditions. But in the event, like you fly through a cloud or some visible moisture and your static port becomes blocked, and for whatever reason your alternate static source isn't working, you can actually climb or descend to an area of warmer weather, and then it'll unfreeze and then it'll start working again. So that's something to consider, like in air. Yeah, you can land, but you really want that altimeter to be working as you're coming into land.
And so there's another method too. If that static port doesn't work, that alternate static port, you know what you can do?
Bust the VSI.
Yeah, bust the window of the instrument. And the least useful of all three is the VSI. So if you break the window of the VSI, then it would use air from inside the cockpit to go to that instrument. That becomes a static port. The instrument in itself becomes a static port or an alternate static port. That's last resort.
Yeah,
because in case of a
the Pitot-static system, the entire system, all the instruments are sealed, right?
Yeah.
So if you pop the glass on
they're all sealed and they're all
on the VSI
connected.
Yes, then you're introducing air from inside the cockpit into the system as like a makeshift static port. But yeah, I wouldn't go around, it's like, oh, something's not working, and pop that VSI, because flight school's not going to be happy with you.
That's in case of urgency, break the window, break the glass. There is this concept I talk about in the course, which is always difficult to understand, which is the high to low, look out below. High to low, look out below. So high pressure, if you go from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure, and you don't change the altimeter setting appropriately, what can happen?
Your altimeter is going to read that you've remained at the same altitude while you've descended.
Okay. So you are closer to the ground.
Yes.
Than your altimeter is telling you.
Yes.
Your altimeter is lying to you.
Yep.
It's giving you a false sense of security. That's dangerous. High to low, look out below, right? So high pressure to low pressure, or high temperature to low temperature, both of these. And the reason is because high temperature inside of that altimeter, it's like having a high temperature inside of a pressure cooker. What happens when we have a pressure cooker and we close the lid, or your tire in your car and they start to get hot, then the pressure increases. So that's the same thing. As temperature increases, pressure increases inside of that enclosed environment. That's not always true in the atmosphere, but inside that thing, that is true. So high to low, look out below. So you got to be careful with that. There's a lot of questions in the FAA database where they try to trick you because they ask you about your true altitude versus your indicated altitude. So in this case, what is the relationship between your true altitude and your indicated altitude? Your true altitude is higher or lower than your indicated altitude.
For
high to low.
High to low, your true altitude is going to be lower than your indicated.
Your true altitude is going to be lower than your indicated, meaning your altimeter is lying to you.
Yes.
Reverse statement, your indicated altitude is higher or lower than your true altitude?
Your indicated altitude?
Yeah.
Is higher than your true altitude.
There you go. There's a reason I'm having you say this is because the FAA awards these questions two different ways. Sometimes they give you the true altitude as a reference. Sometimes they give you the indicated altitude as a reference. And that gets students really, really messed up. So just and this is a tip for you that are watching. Just make sure that you do what Jason just did. The high too low, your altimeter is lying, this is dangerous, then you have to think about, I always kind of draw it on a piece of paper just to make sure. So, and sometimes they'll tell you the other way around. If you go from an area of low pressure to an area of high pressure, then it's the opposite. Then your altimeter it's lying, but in a good way. It's basically telling you that you're much lower than you actually are, which means that you would be safe and you would just start climbing. So, okay. We talked about true altitude. We talked about indicated altitude. What's absolute altitude? Do you remember?
I want to say that absolute altitude was your altitude above obstacles, and it was just another AGL, essentially.
It's AGL. Yeah, it's AGL. So we don't use it very much in aviation because we don't have an instrument to tell us. But in a perfect world, if you set your altimeter correctly, what is the relationship between indicated and true altitude? Are they the same? Are they higher? Are they lower?
Should be the same.
It should be the same, right? If you're flying right, if you have your altimeter set correctly, indicated equals true. And then maybe we'll end this on this thought right here, which is your pressure altitude and your density altitude. What are those two terms?
Pressure altitude is your altitude corrected for non-standard pressure.
The pressure altitude is your altitude corrected for non-standard pressure. What does that mean?
It means that you have high and low pressure systems, and so pressure changes across the Earth, and you're not ever going to have that standard day.
Does that mean that my altimeter is going to show different? If I'm in Prescott at 5,000 feet and the pressure altitude is 6,000 feet, what is my altimeter going to show?
It's a performance. It's not an altimeter. It's
okay.
Performance.
Okay.
Altitude.
It's a performance altitude.
It's an equivalent altitude, essentially.
It's an equivalent altitude for performance purposes.
For performance.
Is the pressure altitude the one, or is density altitude the one? What's density altitude?
Density altitude is pressure altitude corrected for non-standard temperature.
So we add another factor now. We convert for
pressure altitude is the step.
It's
density
a step.
altitude is what we really care about, because on those hot, low pressure days, we want to know what the equivalent altitude is that we're flying at.
So the fill in the blank, the higher or lower the density altitude is, the worse the performance.
Higher.
The higher the density altitude, the worse the performance. When we have a high density altitude, what kind of air density do we have?
Low air density.
Low air density. That messes people up so much, right? This is actually a question we have on our Part 107 test, and people every once in a while come back and say, "Oh, this is incorrect. High density altitude. It's density altitude. It should be one word. It should be hyphenated.
Yes.
It's a type of altitude. So that means that you're at a high altitude, means that you have low air density in this case. Okay, very good. And then, so you're saying that if I'm in Prescott, you're at 5,000 feet elevation and the density altitude is 8,000 feet. Why do I care?
Because the airplane's going to perform as though it was at 8,000 feet, even though you're at 5.
Very good.
Yeah, I like that answer.
Sorry, I didn't let you talk much.
That's okay.
I get excited about this topic. Any other questions for Jason?
Let's go back to the altimeter. So you're at an airport with no weather reporting, uncontrolled. You're on the ground. How are you going to figure out what your altimeter setting is going to be?
I'm going to use standard day and calculate it based on the field elevation.
Simpler.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good idea, but yes, there's a simpler way.
So you're sitting in the airplane. You're going to pull out your E6B and start doing all those calculations. Why don't you just take your altimeter and just set it to field elevation and then read your altimeter setting from there?
Yeah, makes sense.
As long as you know field elevation, but you can't calculate any of that unless you know field elevation. So yeah, that's how you do it, and that's actually also how you verify the altimeter. When you set your altimeter, if it's reported 2992, you put 2992. What if the airfield is 5,000 feet, but your altimeter is showing 5,500 feet? Is that right?
No.
No, you did something wrong,
Yeah.
right? So what's the limit? What's the amount of plus or minus
75.
75 feet, right? So you have to make sure that you also have to be careful, because some airports, that airport elevation is picked at one spot at the airport. It's called the ARP, Airport Reference Point, and some airports have slopes. So you could be
Brisket.
exactly. You could be 10 feet, 20 feet lower than that spot. So you have to somewhat know. If you live in Florida, it's fine. But if you live in other places, it might become tricky. So you might look at it and be like, it's off by quite a bit. But then if you think about it, you might be 20 feet below right there. So 75 feet is still quite a bit of a margin. Okay. I think we're going to wrap it up. You did good on this one. I think this is an area that you're a bit more familiar with. And then
It's a bit more logical, I think.
Yeah.
I can work through a lot of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, instruments are pretty logical. So, all right. Thanks, folks, for watching. And we'll see you next week for the second part of Fly Instruments. We still have quite a few more to talk about.